So I think I came up with the perfect analogy for the middle class using a magic trick. So check this out. I have a Ziploc bag, and inside the Jack of Clubs, which represents the middle class. So hopefully you can see it on both sides. Hopefully you can also hear it, because in a moment I'm gonna... Wait a minute. Where did it go?
Erased from existence.
Magic tricks can be fun, but whatever you do, don't skip to the beginning of the video and play it back in slow motion, or else you'll be very frustrated that you'll still have no idea how it was done. But speaking of the disappearing middle class, a recent article was published that Gen Z doesn't think $74,000 a year in income is considered middle class. So today I do want to show you how much money you have to make to be considered middle class in the US nowadays. And I'm going to start my research at the most prestigious school of economics, TikTok. Now, if you answer yes to most of the questions in the video you're about to see, then you might be middle class, but you're definitely not rich, so let's check it out.
Why does every single person have this fridge? And it's always out in the garage too. And if you're upper middle class, you probably have the freezer as well.
Personally, I don't have that fridge right now, but my parents did when I was growing up, so I guess you could say that's a sign of middle class. And I also have that LaCroix in the background, and that's a sign of upper middle class.
You have a Costco membership. I personally don't have one, but I think my mom does. Costco has some great deals though, and they have gas, which is always like 20 cents cheaper than everywhere else.
So I do have a Costco membership, and I save 2% with their executive membership, and I even have my car insurance through Costco because they do everything. They're even starting to sell crypto. No, they're not. I made that up.
Have you been on a cruise? I've never been on a cruise, but every family I know goes on one religiously, like Carnival or Royal Caribbean. I don't really get the appeal of them though.
So true story, the last time I was on a cruise was with my parents in high school, so I have not been on a cruise ship since, which I guess that means if you answered no, you don't go on cruises, that's a sign of probably middle class.
Do you enjoy any of these establishments?
That's me.
I enjoy every single one of these establishments, besides Trader Joe's, which is overrated.
Everyone knows the best thing to go to Target for is their Threshold furniture collection. That is the bougiest thing you can buy at Target.
Does every street in your neighborhood have a theme? Not anymore, but this is so true. It's always like animal names or like the names of presidents.
It's a true story. The street I live in today, right now, has an animal name in it. So I guess that's middle class, and I too am indubitably in debt. So based on this short TikTok survey, I guess I'm middle class, even though this isn't really scientific. So instead I want to show you the real numbers that's backed by real data about how much you really need to make to be considered really middle class. So let me show you what's really going on, and let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andrei Jikh. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the magic of the disappearing middle class. So what does middle class actually mean? Middle class is defined as someone who is neither rich nor poor, but someone who's somewhere in the middle. Now, the most interesting part is that surveys taken throughout the years actually show that most people consider themselves to be middle class regardless of their income. Now, if you pause that part of the video, you also probably noticed that the data shows most people actually call themselves working class, the Jack Dawsons of Titanic, the poker-playing, hard-working third-class passengers. Actually, it's just a nice way of saying maybe lower part of the middle class, but still firmly in the middle class. And there's a really interesting explanation for why most people call themselves middle class even if they make a lot of money. And the reason is because it's the best thing to say. If you say that you are poor or lower class, it might make people think that you are lazy or entitled. And if you say you are upper class or you're rich, then nobody's gonna like you. So saying you're part of the middle class is the best thing to say to fit right in. But still, what does middle class actually mean today?
The middle class was once a symbol of the American dream. But the American middle class today paints quite a different picture.
Being middle class, I feel like you're really just in between a rock and a hard place. You know, you're in a spot where everyone's like, hey, you're doing better than, low class. You're doing great. You should be fine. And you're underneath the people who are actually doing fine.
It was at least a secure category. Your kids would go to a school that you felt at least okay about. You probably own a car or two, and you'd own your own home, and you could pay for your kids' college educations.
Now, looking at this question using Pew Research numbers from 2023, data shows that middle class means anyone making between $38,000 to $114,000 a year, and roughly 73% of Americans say they identify in this range. Now, the more I try to understand why there's such a huge range of incomes for the middle class, the more I came to the realization that there's no real hard definition for the middle class. It's always going to change, and it's a moving target based on how expensive life is and based on the choices we make on how we spend our money and how we feel about it. How else can we explain that someone making less than $10,000 a year can feel like they're the upper class, and how someone making over $170,000 a year can feel like they're the lower class? That's probably because they live in New York or San Francisco and it's their fault, but all I'm saying is that a portion of that data can at least be explained by how we feel about where we chose to live and how we choose to spend our money. But for most people, I think we can all agree that middle class just means having kids, being able to afford their education, having a car, and having a house. And if that's the definition of middle class, unfortunately, that target is moving farther and farther away from us.
While incomes stagnate, the cost of living has risen dramatically over the years. To put it into perspective, the average household income in the US saw just a 16% increase over the last 50 years. In comparison, housing costs increased by 190%, and college tuition shot up by nearly 264% in the same time period.
Now, if we can all be on the same page and agree that part of being middle class also means the ability to buy a house, then $74,000 a year is not enough to realize it. And the biggest reason why is because of real estate, which also happens to be the biggest driver of wealth for the middle class. Right now, buying a house is not for the middle class, it's for the upper middle class. And that's because the median sales price of a home at the end of 2023 was about $431,000. Now, if someone hypothetically with a good credit score decided to walk up to their bank today and ask to borrow money, that bank would probably lend them at a 7% interest rate, which is the national average. And the traditional rule of home buying also says we should try to put down 20% of the overall price of the house as a down payment to avoid paying what's called principal mortgage insurance, or PMI. But the reality is, no one really puts down 20%. Instead, the average person who buys a house for their first time will usually only have 6 to 7% for a down payment. So that means for the average first-time home buyer, they'd have to save a little over $30,000 as a down payment, and they'd have to borrow the rest, which is $400,000 at 7%. But if you did that, your total monthly payment, all in, would be a little over $3,000. Now that might be affordable to some of the middle class, but for the banks, that's still not enough, because they want to know whatever that number ends up being, that it represents no more than 28% of a person's monthly income before taxes. In other words, triple that monthly income, which works out to an annual income of almost $130,000. And that's just to qualify buying the average house today, which is also why a lot of people are cynical about being part of the middle class, and some people say that it's just an illusion that's becoming harder and harder to believe in. But going back to the perception of being the middle class, based on our values as we compare them to everyone else, we also have to remember that not everyone values the same things. Not everyone values, for example, buying a house. Even the people that can easily afford to buy them. Like Ramit Sethi, for example, who talks about this all the time. He prefers to rent because he believes the savings he will get from renting will grow faster in the stock market while giving him more flexibility in his lifestyle. So you can still choose to rent and end up extremely wealthy, because owning is not the only path to wealth. Again, reinforcing the idea that part of being the middle class is how we feel about our values as they compare to other people with the same values at the same place at the same time frame, which is made so much harder for us to focus on what we truly value when we have access to social media that tells us no income is ever good enough unless we got that swaggity swag and drippity drip. But I do think it's safe to say that anyone making $74,000 a year has a reasonable middle-class income, especially if they chose to rent. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that not everyone agrees. There's a video that caused a lot of discussion about that same $74,000 a year income. And that's not to say that I agree or disagree with it, but I want to show you my thought process, and hopefully you can do your own research and it helps you out.
Gen Z doesn't agree that $74,000 is middle class. No kidding, it's not even close. Check this out. If you take $74,000 for a Gen Zer, let's say they have a bachelor's degree and they're 25 years old. First of all, $74,000 is much higher than the average income. Most Gen Zers are probably making anywhere from 40 to 50, maybe 60, but let's use 74.
By the way, just for context, the youngest and oldest Gen Z is a range between 11 to 26 years old. So I have to agree that most Gen Z that are 26 years old are probably not making $74,000 a year. So now let's take a look at the breakdown of some of the expenses.
The take home after taxes, 401k, and health insurance is $4,300. The average college monthly payment on a loan is about $500. You're down to $3,800.
By the way, I double checked that number from the BLS on education, and the monthly payment for the average salaried associate's degree was about $436, $621 for a bachelor's, $720 for a master's, and it goes up from there. So I think $500 a month is a pretty reasonable assumption.
Let's say this person is financially responsible, decides to split a 2-bedroom apartment in a medium-sized city like Orlando, so that their payment is $1,200 apiece, $200 for utilities, so $1,400.
Okay, so here, $2,400 a month is definitely on the higher end of the renting spectrum. The national average rent right now is a little under $2,000 a month, but rents are falling. In fact, right now is one of the few times in US history where it makes more sense to rent a house than it is to buy a house. And the average utilities across the country range state by state, but $400 is on the higher end of that.
Now, unless they're going to have Lucky Charms and peanut butter and jelly, their groceries are going to cost about $600 if they're trying to get chicken, beef, and some healthy stuff.
$600 a month in groceries is a lot of money, but if that's what you value, I think it's going to be really hard to be middle class. A study by GoBankingRates.com showed a more reasonable range is actually between $300 to $500 a month for a single person.
You have a $400 car payment, $200 in insurance, $150 for gas, $100 for a cell phone, leaves you with $950.
So I did a car market update video that you can watch somewhere up here, but the truth is, car payments are even higher. The average monthly payment for a brand new car is $726 and $533 for a used car, and car insurance is about $165.
This is no savings, investment, no emergency fund. Let's give them at least $300 to go on a couple dates or to hang out with their friends for the month so they can enjoy life a little bit. They're left with only $650. A bachelor's degree, $74K salary. You are splitting a 2-bedroom apartment with a friend and only have $650 left a month. It would take you years to save up the $30,000 that you would need for a down payment on a house with the closing costs. But even if you could get that down payment saved, you would still need to make $120,000 a year to be considered for a $400,000 loan.
So overall, I'd have to say that based on the data, it does show that the middle class has been shrinking over the last few decades, and instead, it's the upper middle class that has been expanding. So overall, here's my personal opinion. I'm not really sure what I'm trying to say in this video, other than I learned throughout making this video that it is objectively becoming harder to be a part of the middle class, especially if you value the same things that everyone else is chasing. But I've also learned that a lot of our life comes down to our choices and our luck. For example, as many as 1 in 4 people making $200,000 a year in the US are living paycheck to paycheck. And that seems like a result of bad choices, choosing to stay in a high cost of living area, when instead you could choose to save and invest and live below your means and not go out to eat and live with a roommate for a couple years. I still live with one to this day. That helped me save past 6 figures at age 26, which set me up for more good choices. But I also can't ignore the fact that so much of it came down to luck. Like, I was lucky to be born in a third world country in a time that was really poor, to parents that didn't know how to manage money, which pushed me just enough, not over the edge, but just enough to be inspired to learn how to invest, and lucky enough to get into the market when I did in 2014, right before the growth phase. But I had no control over any of that. But I did control my choices. I chose to read all the financial blogs and Graham Stephan videos on income updates that inspired me so much. I related to those choices and sacrifices of living below your means to have more so you could save and invest, and those were my values that I compared myself against. That was my middle class. Sometimes I wonder, what if someone watching my video right now is like, well, I want to be where Andrei's at. And then someone like me is like, well, I want to be like Alex Hormozi and build a $100 million empire. And then someone like Hormozi's like, well, I want to be like Tony Robbins and inspire millions of people. And then someone like Tony Robbins is like, well, I want to be like Warren Buffett and have billions in the bank. And then someone like Warren Buffett's like, well, I want to be like you. Someone watching this video right now who might be in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Someone who has the rest of their life ahead of them to make good choices. Sometimes I wonder, if a billionaire had their same circumstances and they could relive their life again, would they make the same choices? I don't know where I was going with that, but it made sense in my head. Thank you so much for sticking with me in 2023. I hope you created a lot of value for yourself, your family, and other people. And as always, I would love to see you back here next year in 2024 on Mondays, Fridays, sometimes Wednesdays. I'll see you soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.